Good afternoon, class. Welcome to another video session with your philosophy professor, Orozco here. And today we're going to be talking about another philosopher from the Middle Ages, and his name is Saint Thomas Aquinas. And last week I introduced another medieval philosopher, Saint Anselm, and he introduced in philosophical history the ontological argument for the existence of God. And we talked about that, and I'll review that a little bit with you in a minute. But first, in the Middle Ages, why are we into all of this church and God kind of motif? I don't know if you can kind of hear the monk music. I decided to put a little ambiance or atmospheric kind of effect here. So those are monks chanting Gregorian chant. The reason for that is that at this particular time in Western history, the Catholic Church was the dominant cultural institution at the time. It had the power to elect a king or to influence a kingdom, to influence a war, or for a country not to go to war. It could put people in prison, torture people, canonize people. It had tremendous cultural influence. It's the Middle Ages, and Catholicism is the dominant cultural force. And so they're talking about God and religion at this particular period of time because that's the concern for people in the Middle Ages. They're not talking about global warming yet. They're not talking about social media. They're not talking about NSA wiretapping. They're not talking about a global pandemic with the COVID virus. Those are all modern considerations. Capitalism. We're not talking about those kind of things in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is God and salvation. And it's a period of time roughly between the year 1000 and the year 1400. After the year 1400, we start to get into what is called the Renaissance. But right now we're in the Middle Ages, a time period dominated by the Catholic Church. And I'd like you to think about like castles and kings and queens and monks and bishops and knights in shining armor. Kind of think Game of Thrones, okay, the Middle Ages, big thick walls and castle sieges and the Crusaders, things like that. So it's the Middle Ages. The church is the Catholic Church is the dominant cultural force, and so all of the philosophy at the time is being used to discuss the idea of God and salvation. That's where human thinking is. We're not into the age of painting and sculpture and stuff. That's later on. Right now, it's still the Catholic Church and theological reflections about the nature of God and salvation. So last week we talked about Anselm, and Saint Anselm had come up with this argument, the ontological argument, which is kind of a make-believe conversation between a believer and an atheist. And so the believer asks an atheist, it's kind of an imaginary conversation in Anselm's mind. The believer asks the atheist, have you ever heard of the concept of God? And an atheist, even not a devout, hardcore atheist, would say, yes, of course, everybody has heard of the existence of God or the concept of God. So the next question that the believer will ask the atheist is God typically defined as a supreme being by definition? And the atheist at this point could think, well, wait a minute, I don't believe in God. But the believer is not asking whether the atheist believes in God. The believer is simply asking, is the typical definition of God that God is a supreme being, a being beyond which beyond every other being? And an atheist would have to say, yeah, by definition, that's how people describe God. So the third point that the believer comes up with is, can God as a supreme being have any imperfections? And an atheist would probably have to answer, well, no, by definition, a supreme being can't have any imperfections. And so the fourth part of the ontological argument by Anselm is that this make-believe conversation, the believer asks or makes this final summarizing statement to the non-believer or to the atheist, and he says, well, if the concept of God is that it's a perfect being, then a perfect being cannot lack anything, and a perfect being cannot lack the quality of existence, because that would be an imperfection. A perfect being must have all things, including the act of existence. And so that argument in philosophical history is famous. It's got some weaknesses, and even a Catholic monk, Ganilon, I told you last time in the video, that a Catholic monk heard this and said, well, look, just because I come up with a perfect definition of something, that still doesn't imply that it exists. I can think of a perfect bank account, which has many, 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 many zeros after it. That's what my idea of a perfect bank account would be. But does that necessarily mean that that perfect bank account exists other than just as an idea? And Ganelon kind of put it differently. He said, well, I could think about the idea of a perfect island that has all the beautiful running water and treasure and all this perfect stuff that a perfect island would have. But does that really exist other than in my mind? I mean, there's beautiful islands in the world, but let's just say a perfect island that had, all things, including secret treasure and stuff like that. And he's saying it's just kind of something that exists in the mind. That's Anselm in about the year 1070. Anselm was born in 1033. So he wrote this later on toward the year 1100. Anselm died in 1104. Now we're jumping ahead a couple of hundred years. It's still the Middle Ages. The monks are still singing. It's still Catholicism, monasteries. And Aquinas comes along. He's also an Italian. Anselm was Italian. And Thomas Aquinas, Tommaso de Aquino, he's an Italian. He becomes a Dominican friar. It's a religious order that yours truly here entered back in the late 70s. And I studied with the Dominicans for 7 years, thinking that I would go on in religious life and stay there for the rest of my life. But that was not to be. But I did study in a weird kind of parallel universe. I did study in this same community just in the 70s. This community is like 800 or 900 years old, a Catholic teaching order. The Dominicans are a Catholic teaching order within the Catholic Church. They dedicate themselves to teaching and academics, and that's something that I wanted to do back then. And I stayed for 7 years. You've heard about the movie 12 Years a Slave. My book title is going to be 7 Years a Monk. Anyway, Thomas Aquinas, he wants to also argue for the existence of God because, again, it's the Middle Ages. This is the motif at the time. This is the dominant concern for people. People in the Middle Ages didn't live that long. We know from their bone structure that, people didn't have many teeth by the time they died. Women died in childbirth. Typically, and children died in early infancy. So death and mortality with no antibiotics, no prenatal care, no surgery, they didn't really have anything to ensure long mortality. Food was probably infected. People died a lot in the Middle Ages. Plagues, just like the pandemic we're having now, plagues could wipe out. In 1400, the Black Plague, bubonic plague, wiped out 2/3 of Europe. So right now we've had like 14 or 15,000 deaths as a result of, I think in the United States, as a result of coronavirus. Man, Europe lost 66% of its population in 1 year. I mean, we're talking 2 out of every 3 persons in Europe died in the year 1400 due to the plague. Terrible devastation. So people in the Middle Ages knew that life was short, and so the church was always teaching people, you better get your life right because God is coming and you're going to face him soon. So, there's that's the teaching of the Middle Ages. But Aquinas doesn't use a kind of imaginary conversation to talk about God. He uses something called natural theology. Natural theology. And that's something that's mentioned in the book, Natural Theology. So let me talk about that a little bit. Aquinas was an Aristotelian. He had read, from, the Greek writing and the Greek writings about Aristotle's thinking. And we talked about Aristotle too. This idea that Aristotle sees that there is a goal-oriented there's a goal orientation for all things in being. Everything has a teleos. In Greek, teleos means goal. Teleology, the study of goal orientation. And so and Aquinas is very much an Aristotelian, but using this idea of Aristotle, Aquinas would say that even a rock, this low form of being, I mean, it's a pretty heavy, dense form of being. It can't reproduce, it can't move, it just sits there, but even it has a purpose, which is, when it's in the earth, and erupts onto the surface in some kind of volcanic explosion, and it solidifies into granite. Even this granite is forming landmass that eventually will break down in time. This can eventually, with rain and erosion and earthquakes and cracking, can eventually, I mean, it's a smaller piece now. How big was this piece of granite in Spring Valley? It's in Spring Valley that I'm grabbing this rock. How big was this piece of granite when it was in the earth and broke out? Now it's just this. Eventually it will turn into fine grains of sand, and it will form landmass, things that can actually grow even in decomposed granite. Things can grow in decomposed granite. And so you have another kind of, and it has a purpose to form landmass. Then you talk about another thing that's in nature, a plant, this succulent, and it has a purpose as well to reproduce and to grow. And it has a purpose. When I was out in the garden looking for some little props, I found this little snail. Hope you can see it. It doesn't have the slug in it, so don't get grossed out. It's tiny. It has a purpose, feeding on plants. It's kind of a nuisance, but it has a purpose in nature. It's fulfilling its nature, the way Aristotle thinks that everything fulfills its nature. It's trying to achieve its potential by being the best little snail that it can be. And of course, for Aristotle and also for Aquinas, human beings, when we talk about, inanimate nature like a rock or a plant, and then things that can move around like insects or birds, and we talk about humans, Aristotle would say this person has a destiny to fulfill itself, to become happy. And Aquinas likes all of that analysis, teleology, but he has a goal in his writing, and that's to bring people to faith. And inspired with Aristotle's writing, he develops this kind of approach to faith called natural theology. Natural theology. So using Aristotle's kind of analysis that things have a goal, he would say that if you and natural theology, one more thing, it's an approach to God which uses the things we know to try to talk about the things that we don't know. So it moves from the things that we can see and observe to then try to move to the things that we can't observe, which is God. To move, natural theology is to move from the things that we know to the things that we don't know. So Aristotle sees nature and sees that everything has a goal. And Aquinas sees that too. And if you think about human beings, Aristotle would have said a human being wants to be fulfilled, by being happy. But Aquinas is a Christian, so Aquinas would say, yes, a human being has tried to fulfill its goals. But if you notice, in terms of a human being, there's all these activities that we do to try to be happy, all these activities, but you notice they always leave us a little bit short. We work, we get a degree, we get a job, we fall in love, we might have a family, we might travel, and yet we get old and we start to decay, we start to break down in time. And so there we are on our deathbed, or as we get older and we're losing our sight and our faculties and we're sicker and we can't really move around, we're kind of slow, we've slowed down mentally, but there's this part of us that still has this desire. And Aquinas would say, kind of improving or kind of going beyond Aristotle. Aristotle says we're trying to be happy, but then we die. But Aquinas says from his faith perspective, that can't be the answer, because human beings seem to have this natural desire for a supernatural goal, because nothing can fulfill us. We're always falling short of this real fulfillment. Our parents get older or we fall in love, but something happens. We're always losing our health, our vitality. And Aquinas says, but yet we have this incredible desire for something that really lasts. Nobody on their deathbed is saying, I'm ready to go now. You're thinking, God, I wanted more. And Aquinas would say that is God. That's our desire for some kind of supernatural goal. So let me go back and kind of put this together. So natural theology is it's an approach to faith. It's kind of like a way to talk about faith, but using our observations about human existence to see if maybe we can talk about the existence of God just by observing human existence. So all these things want fulfillment. We all want fulfillment. And yet here we are as a being that seems to be frustrated in its fulfillment. And Aquinas would say that's because in us there's something that's this supernatural desire for a supreme good, which would be God. In other words, we can't possess it in this life, but we desire it. And Aquinas would say that's pointing us from our earthly experience to some kind of divine experience. Now, you don't have to buy that. That's just Aquinas' approach in natural theology. Okay, so I hope I didn't lose you on that stuff. Let me toggle down the monks. Anyway, so now Aquinas is going to turn his attention to the idea of the existence of God. It's the Middle Ages. This is what people are talking about. They're not talking about global warming. So Aquinas, again, like Anselm, a couple hundred years later, Aquinas, and he knows Anselm's argument. He's not impressed by Anselm's argument. He thinks he can do better. So using natural theology, he'll say, well, let's look at human existence. Let's look at natural existence. And for Aquinas, in order to prove the existence of God, you have to use natural theology. You have to start from what we can observe. And for Aquinas, there's two types or two fundamental categories of being. There is something which he would call contingent being and something called necessary being. Now, what's contingent being? Now, think about being. We talked about this earlier in class. Being is everything that has existence: air, space, molecules, viruses, bacteria, rocks, plants, planets, stars, the sun, energy, whatever you want to talk about, all of those things, even thought, has existence. But all of that, all of being, contingent being, has a beginning and an end. So a rock, it has a beginning and end. At one point, it wasn't in existence, then it came into existence, then it's going to break down and turn into sand or something else. You and I have contingent existence. I was born, in the 60s, and you guys were probably born in the year 2001, 2002, and you're going to live 80 or 90 or 100 years, but you have a limited amount of time. At one point, you weren't in existence. And the sun, it's going to last billions of years, but even it didn't exist at one point, and at some point it won't exist in the future because it has a limited span of existence. That's what Aquinas means by contingent being. That is, being that has a beginning and an end. It comes to be, it's generated into being, and then it corrupts. It goes out of being. A sun becomes like a supernova and explodes and then becomes a black hole. And so it has a limited existence. And that's all of being, whether you're talking about a plant or a rock or a galaxy. It has limited being. That's what he calls the first part of being, contingent being. But he also says there's another part of being which is called necessary being. And necessary being is now hang on for a second. Necessary being is the part of being which causes other being. So here I am as a contingent being, right? But in one point, even though I'm limited in time and space, I'm going to live 80, 90, 100 years, I'm limited in time and space, but yet even though I'm a contingent being, there's something in me that can create other beings, bring other things into being. For instance, I didn't make that guitar back there, but that guitar was brought into being by something. I brought my kid. I'm a contingent being, but I brought my two sons, along with the help of my wife. We brought my two sons into being. So I'm a contingent being, but at one point I'm also a necessary being to create other things, to bring other things into existence. So I'm contingent, but I also have the quality of bringing other things into being, like a guitar, if I was a guitar maker, or an artist, or in the sense bringing my two sons into being. So I have the ability to, I'm the necessary being, being to bring other things into existence. Okay, but on one level, Aquinas would say, even though you and I can create things and bring things into being, and by the way, I should back up and say this is Aquinas's third argument for the existence of God. He's famous in church history for bringing up 5 arguments for the existence of God. In this class, we're not going to go into all 5 arguments. This is a Chinese buffet class. We're taking a little bit and moving on. So this is called the third argument for the existence of God. So in terms of necessary being, Aquinas would say there's only one truly necessary being, a being that truly is necessary, and that being is called God, because God is necessary to explain the existence of contingent being. Remember, contingent being is being that comes into being and then it goes out of being. But there must be a being that's responsible for bringing contingent being into being. So there has to be a being that pre-exists all of contingent being. So at one point, think about the galaxy or the universe. At one point, the universe was nothing but non-being, because obviously we talk about the Big Bang. So what was prior to the Big Bang? There was nothingness. And so Aquinas believes, because the universe itself exists and then it can go out of existence, it's contingent. Even if it lasts billions of years, it's contingent because it has a beginning and an end. But what could bring contingent being into being? What pre-exists in order to bring a contingent being into being? So you and I have to pre-exist to bring our children into being. We have to exist first to bring our children into being. You don't have children yet, but you need to be here in order to exist. But what about at the moment of creation, when there was all contingent being was in a state of potential? It wasn't quite in being. It wasn't in being yet. It was simply the potential for being, but it was still non-being. It wasn't in being yet. What can explain that? And Aquinas would say a necessary being, a being that in and of its nature is a necessary being. How can I give you an example of this? So let's go ahead and use this lighter. Boom. Now let me bring it over here so you can see it better. This lighter is not a really good example of God as the necessary being, because you can see that it wasn't lit, and then boom, I brought it into its active form. It's lit now. But this is not a good example of God, because God just is lit. So let me try to use another example here. So if you can see this candle here, this candle, let's just assume that I should have had this candle already burning. This candle is already in existence prior to anything else being in existence. So this candle is an example of God in that it's not a good example of God, because obviously it had to be lit. But if you can think about the essence of God as a necessary being, is that God's essence is to exist. And so hopefully I'm not confusing you, but let me use a slightly different analogy. Let me go ahead and say to you that I could say, you know what? I have a lot of money. I'm going to try to be impressive to you. Man, I have a lot of money. But notice, if I say I have a lot of money, or if I say I have youth right now, I have you, or you're younger, you have youth and vitality, you have it. Notice that the verb have can also imply I might not have it forever, because I have it, but I could also lose it. And maybe at one time I didn't even have it. I have it. But what if somebody could say to you, man, I don't have money. I am money. I am money. Can you hear a difference between saying I have money and I am money? That's a really different kind of form of existence. And God, who is the truly necessary being to bring all contingent being into being, God doesn't have existence. God is existence. So this is God, always lit. Now you can ask a question. Did God get lit from some other God that pre-existed? In other words, did God receive a light from some other God, and then this goes back in time so that God got created by another God, by another God? Aquinas would say, you can talk about intermediate gods if you want to, but at some point there just has to be a God that just is, that is the reason for all other beings to come into being. And that's Aquinas's third argument, an argument which moves from or talks about two types of being: contingent being, which is being that comes into existence, and then necessary being, which has to be the one necessary being that has to exist in order to explain how contingent being could come into being. Now, Aquinas talks about all of these kind of theological concepts. His approach to theology and faith is always to use natural observations and natural analysis to try to move to the level of faith. And he does this in his massive work that he did just before he died in 1275, I think. He had a brain hemorrhage and was not able to finish it. But his big magnum opus, his major work, is called the Summa Theologica. Summa meaning the summary, the Summa Theologica, in which he tries to talk about all of faith from using the perspective, using Aristotle in many ways, but using Aristotle in a way that's called natural theology to try to explain faith, but using natural experience to try to explain that. He does that in his massive work on faith called the Summa Theologica. And there's many other things in the Summa Theologica. Basically, we read, or this little argument that you got introduced to, is one of the first articles in the Summa Theologica. It's at the very beginning, because why talk about God and all the things of God without first of all talking about how God exists? So this is one of the first articles and chapters in the Summa Theologica. After that, Aquinas goes into many, many other questions that are very important also if you're a person of faith, because you can't just say God exists. There's other questions. How does God communicate to human beings? What is God's plan for human beings? Um, why did God create human beings? It's one thing to talk about, like in this argument that we just looked at, is that God must exist in order to explain being. Okay, but that's only one part of the consideration of God as a being. Then you have to talk about, how does God, if God is a perfect being and God is a creator, how does God permit evil to exist? How does God permit suffering? How do we find our way to God? What's the way that we do that? And a lot of Aquinas uses Aristotle, because he also uses Aristotelian virtues like temperance and justice and courage, because all of those are ways for us to perfect our being so that we can approach um, the knowledge of God, and be serviceable to God, to be good, loyal creatures to God. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that in the Summa Theologica, there's not just one argument in it. We just looked at the very beginning of the argument. Then there's all these other considerations. Chief among them are, what's God's essence, and how does God allow evil, and what's God's plan, and how are human beings in contact with God, and what's our destiny? Many, many other questions come up that must be addressed when you talk about faith. So anyway, this is sounding kind of churchy right now. I can't help it. So I'm going to end with just signing out. Middle Ages.